In this edition, we've got some fantastic layouts to share with you, including some that have been in operation for decades. As for prototypes, we'll take you to some absolutely amazing railroad destinations and explore great equipment from the past and present. And of course, we all strive to add realism and detail to our layouts. So we'll share some secrets and techniques that will help you make your operation look more authentic. And when you see this graphic, pay attention because it tells you the name of a computer file stored on this DVD, including additional details and techniques for creating and improving your layout. Let's get rolling as we bring the action, power, and creativity of model railroading to life in the Dream, Plan, Build video series.
Back in the early 50s, Lynn Westcott did an article or a series of articles on layout designs and concepts. And one of the things that he came up with was a layout entitled If I Had a Million, where space or financial considerations weren't an issue. And as I looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, I said, well, when I do my ultimate layout, I think I'm going to go back to that philosophy and that concept and build a layout as if I didn't have any financial worries or considerations or space restraint. And that's kind of what got us where we are now.
Where we are now is a giant layout filling 800 square feet in the basement of Monroe Stewart's Washington, D.C. area home. A home which, by the way, was constructed around the layout, which is why you see no pipes, no water heater, or no furnace in the way.
Well, it's kind of ironic. The layout was actually designed before anything. We designed the layout, at least conceptually, and allocated a space of 20 by 40 plus a little shop area. After that, we designed a house to accommodate the layout space. Then after that, we went and found some land to put the house on. So the layout was the beginnings of all of what is here now.
Stewart didn't have $1 million, but he did have the creativity, drive, and determination to make his dream layout come true. But yes, he did spend a great deal of money, not to mention the past decade putting it all together. It shows. Monroe Stewart is a civil engineer and an architect, and he likes the form, the function, and the fun this model railroad provides. For the most part, he models the modern-day chassis system, CSX, and Norfolk Southern that he lived near when he went to school in Virginia. He chose to model the tiny N scale because it allows him to put together super long trains, like this 95-car coal train, and because it allows this artist to let the scenery and the structures dominate the layout.
When I scratch build structures, I am subject to use almost any material that I'll put my hands on. I look at everything as a building component as opposed to whatever it was designed for. I use a number of bottle tops, shampoo bottles, ladder stock, bottles, cardboard cylinders, and almost anything I pick up I can find a use for in terms of a shape or component for some building structure. I do a clinic on shapes or scratch building in N scale, and in that clinic I talk about various shapes, relationships of shapes, sizes of shapes, and footprints and roof forms. And if you look at any structure in the world, you can break it down into a series of geometric shapes. Squares, boxes, rectangles combined with circles or spheres or cylinders. In N scale, a lot of people worry about detail and super detail. And I kind of go on a philosophy, if the shape looks right and the buildings come together right, and you got the feel for the industry or the structure that you're modeling, you can leave it alone and you kind of imply that all the detail is there.
The detail is also there in the Mid-Atlantic Seaport, which is home to the beautiful ships built by Monroe Stewart. It would be nice to say that anybody could put together a layout like this, but it certainly helps if you have the brains and the talent of a Monroe Stewart.
Anybody who is interested in doing a layout this size and with this much complexity, or apparent complexity to it, needs to just stretch out, figure out the basics of what they want to do, what they want to achieve, and just go for it. So many people spend forever designing and planning layouts that they really just don't get any time to do actual construction.
Plastic and wood are two mediums that model railroaders have worked in for many years. But recently, brass has become a third medium that modelers can work in. It's a very exciting style of kit to work with. And today I'm going to talk about building this model here. It's by Sheepscott Scale Products. It's a brass pump house kit in HO scale. Brass models are available in other scales, including N and Z. But this one here will show some of the basic techniques that you can use on other scales. I'll start out by showing you how to cut pieces from a sprue. For this, you want a pair of dedicated shears for cutting through etched metal. And the goal is to cut as close as you can to the part, but you don't want to cut into the part. You can clean up any extra metal with a file. So I'll start out with here, and I'll just go along. You want to cut like that until it snaps. And then one more time, you work down as close as you can. And then we'll just go like such until it breaks free of the sprue. And then one more time, we'll go down along this edge. We'll get that window out. And then we'll come back and get the next window here, like so. And then once you have a couple of parts free, you can go ahead and cut a little bit closer even yet that you're free of the other parts. So you just go along like that and snap it off. You can go in here and just clean up the edge. And as I was mentioning, you can use a metal file or a file to clean off any metal. One good recommendation that I always tell people is to have a dedicated set of metal files. And the reason for that is if you use the files on metal and then you go back and use the same set of files on plastic, you can damage the plastic parts you're working on. So it's always good to have the dedicated set. I just go ahead and mark my file set in metal only. My other set is marked plastic only. And then you just go along where the sprues were. Oops. And you just go along and you just take the file, work it gently. You don't need to apply a ton of pressure, and you just work that edge until it's smooth to the touch. And once all the parts are free, you just want to go ahead and take a look what kind of options you have for this kit. This particular structure has two different ends that you can put on. On the finished model, I went ahead and I used the end with the two windows. If you want to have a second door on the kit, you can go that route. The next step is to bend the three-piece wall section here. And as you can see, there are little perforations in two spots. And to get the right angle true, I'll use this steel machinist square. And one thing here with a wall of this length, you have the two longer walls and then the short end piece. So you want to fold the smallest piece over to avoid any bending or distorting the metal in any way. So you just take the machinist square like this, and then you fold the piece over along the perforation, keeping it lined up as best you can, and then pop it over like that. And if you need to do any work extra to shape the metal, you can certainly do that with your hand or go in with the machinist square and straighten up the edge as you need. Once the walls have been bent to the corners have been bent to 90-degree angles, we're going to go ahead and glue the end wall to the walls that we just bent. And I've already glued the one corner in, so I'm going to go ahead and pick up my corner clamp, open up the jaws here a bit, just like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick up the structure, and then I'm just going to set it in here, like so. And then I'm going to clamp the one corner piece in until we get that angle, or the clamp tight. And it requires a little bit of work to get it set in there just the way you want it. And then I'm going to go ahead and clamp in the other corner. I'll just set this down, make it a little easier to work with. I'll just go ahead and we'll clamp it in, and your goal here is to get the angle at 90 degrees so you have a nice true edge. And it's important with this kit here is that you want the outside wall to go over the end wall. Now that the wall is in the clamp, you'll notice that the clamp has a little notch in it for gluing. And once you have the corner square, you can go ahead and set this down. And this brass kit can be built with either cyanoacrylate adhesive, CA, or solder. I'm going to use CA. For this particular kit, I'm going to use an extra thick version of CA just to make sure the joint stays reinforced. And then I just simply grab a post-it notepad here and just put a little blob of CA on. It doesn't need to be a whole lot. And then I just pick up one of these micro brushes here. And these are disposable brushes that work great for applying CA or any other type of glues. And then the corner clamp here has a little notch in it for applying the CA or any type of glue, depending on what you're working on. And then you just want to run a bead along the joint like so. And you just keep working it in until it fills in that corner there. You want to make sure there's a good tight bond in there, just to be sure that when you work on the kit later on that you don't pull anything apart, particularly after you paint it, because you don't want to have to go back and do any touch-up painting. Then you just go along like so until you have an adequate amount of glue in. Then you want to let that set for a few hours until the joint is sound. And we'll just set aside our glue. The one thing with this brass kit is it comes with a lot of wood parts for framing and for the rafters. When I work on the rafters, I find it easier to use this tool here by Northwest Shortline called the chopper. And it has a little rule marked along the top edges here, so you can go along and put your wood in here and then just chop along. So I'll work from above here and do my best to cut. You just open up the arm like this and then slide in the wood along this edge. You want it snug along the joint. And I go to the 1-inch mark for the rafters, so I just put my 4x6 strip of wood in. I hold it carefully and then I just push the arm down and then it chops it free. And you just repeat that process until you have the 16 rafters needed for the kit. The next step is to cut the bracing for the building that goes around the bottom edge and then that goes along the top here, that it supports the top of the building and also provides the edge for the rafters to rest on. Once you have all your rafters cut, you can turn your attention to working on the 12x12 beams. For that, you just need a basic miter box and a hobby saw. You just want to go ahead and you just take the rafter. Once you have it measured, you go in and you just use the straight cutting option. You slide in your hobby saw and you cut away and repeat the process 5 times until you have the 4 bottom braces and then the beam that'll go along the center. Once you have the framing added to your structure, you can go ahead and get it set for painting. To start out with, you want to prime the structure. I used Rust-Oleum Auto Primer, but you can use any primer that you're comfortable with. As with any painting projects, you want to be sure that you're working in a spray booth that vents to the outside of the building and that you're wearing rubber gloves to protect your hands and a dust mask or a respirator to protect yourself from breathing in any fumes or paint particulates. And then, after I let the primer dry, I went ahead and I added the 2 colors for this building, TH&B Cream for the stone portion and Mineral Red. I used an airbrush to apply these colors, letting the cream or the lighter color set for a full day, and then I came back, masked the stone portion of the building off, and then I painted the bricks with the Mineral Red. After the paint had been given sufficient time to dry, I went ahead and I weathered the structure, and this is a really neat trick that you can apply to any medium you're working in. I just take a little dish here with some water in it. To highlight the mortar and the brick portion of the building, I used aged concrete. And with any paint that you work with, you want to go ahead and stir it in the jar instead of shaking it, because if you shake the paint's going to dry along this upper lip and it's going to seal the jar shut and it's going to be really tricky to open. So you just want to go ahead and stir the paint up until you have a good consistency and you've got all the pigment picked up off the bottom. So that's about right there. So then I go ahead and I just take an old brush here. I indicate my old brush with a little blue tape, but if you just have an old brush box or whatever, that'll work fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick up the building. And then we're just going to get a little bit of paint here, dunk it in the water, and then go ahead and just start coaching the paint into the mortar and just work it along. Just keep going until you get the side finished up. Don't worry at this point if you have paint on the brick face, because we'll take care of that in just a minute. So we're just going to keep working that along. And you just keep going in this same motion all the way up the wall, like so. And you can just keep going. And on this end here that I've already finished, I just, to remove the paint from the brick faces, I just take a number 2 pencil eraser and I just want to work along. I've already started on the top. You can see how the brick's a little bit more, it's mineral red color already, and here it's got a little bit of a thin coating of aged concrete on it. So all you do is just go along with the eraser like so. You don't want to apply a whole lot of pressure because it doesn't take that much. You just keep working along here until you start seeing some of the original color starting to show through. You just kind of brush it away every few seconds just to see where you're at, and then you can keep working along like so. And this side here I've already finished taking off most of the paint from the brick faces, and it looks really nice. It looks like there's mortar, gives the structure a little bit more definition. And then for the stone part of the building, I went ahead and used UP dark gray, but you can use any dark color for the mortar, for the stones, which works best for you. And once you have your building weathered, you can go ahead and do the finishing touches with the doors and the windows. The doors and the windows for this structure are 2-piece components. You have your separate window and sash unit here. And then you also have the door and the door frame as separate pieces. And you can go ahead and assemble those with CA just as we've been using with the rest of the kit. You don't need a whole lot with these 2-piece components here because you don't want any of the CA running onto the parts, and then when you prime and paint it you're going to have glue gobs all over everything. So you just put on a little bit and then it'll stay in place and you'll be all set. And then you can finish up by installing the roof on the structure and then painting any spots that you need to touch up, and you're all set. When you start working any new medium, it's best to start with a small kit such as this one. As you gain confidence, then you can start tackling larger structures, and you'll continue to have fun building brass structures for many years.
They were rugged men who had worked the old Madeira Sugar Pine Railroad. They had to be. It was tough, back-busting work at the turn of the century on this old lumber railroad. Those who came to work here high in the Sierra made pretty good money and earned every penny of it.
Logging in the Sierra was the toughest kind of work. There were no level places to work with. Everything was uphill or downhill. If a logger lasted until he was 40 years old, he was considered an old-timer. It was a work for young men. They came up here in the spring from all over the country, hired on, worked either a day or a week or sometimes for years. And in the wintertime, they'd go down to Fresno or Sangor or Merced and either get another job or stay drunk most of the winter. The prize lumber, of course, was sugar pine, which grew here in proliferation unseen anywhere else in the world. The timber was probably about 40% sugar pine and about 30% ponderosa pine. They also took some cedar and some white and Douglas fir. Oak they didn't bother with. It was principally pine. Madeira sugar pine name just typifies what they were after. They used to cut sugar pine for drain boards for sinks when they didn't, days before for mica, and they would cut pieces, slabs 3 and 4 feet wide, maybe 10 feet long. Those they wouldn't flume. They'd carry those down to Madeira in a lumber wagon.
The trains that moved the men in and the lumber out of the steep mountains were workhorses as well. They were Shea steam locomotives, which had an undisputed reputation as the most popular of the different locomotives used in the woods.
The Shea was well suited for a lumber mill because it was easy to maintain. It could go up grades of 10 or 12%, and it had no slippage in its wheels. One other important factor, it could go track equally well either forward or backward, because when you went out in the woods there was usually not a place to turn around. They didn't want to put in elaborate switches, so the cars would be on the back of the engine going up. The engine would run around the train and would pull them on the opposite end, never turning the engine. Some of the Shea engines up here in the woods were never turned in all the time they were here.
But then came the Depression and a halt to the building boom in the country. The sugar pine was forced to a halt in 1931. More than 6 decades later, it's rolling once again. This time, it's a tourist attraction.
My parents came up with the idea in the mid-60s. We had a lodge here in the mountains, and my father was friends with the doctor that worked at the mill down in Sugar Pine in the 30s, and came up with an idea to restore part of the lumbering operation. And since our property bordered the track that operated till 1931, he thought it might be a nice idea to bring some of this history back. And at the time, there were some locomotives and equipment available to the northwest of us, and it all seemed to fit. The concept and the equipment was available at the time.
Pulling this logger train filled with tourists are vintage Shay locomotives, including old number 10. Acquired in the 60s from the last narrow-gauge logging railroad in this country, she is 83 tons of pure mountain beauty. She's just one of the magnificent sights in the Sierra.
Now, the right-of-way that we're on right now, this was originally part of the Madera Sugar Pine Lumber Company. It was in existence from 1899 to 1931. Back then, it was industry standard to clear cut, and that's what they did here. They cut down the ponderosa pine and the sugar pine, and they used it for lumber. Everything else they cut down, they used for firewood. All the trees you see here have grown up since 1924.
Passengers have an opportunity to see Nelder Grove. That's actually where the logging began of the giant sequoia trees off in the distance. That's one of the only giant sequoia tree groves in the area that's in national forest land. They get an idea of the dimension of those trees compared with the rest in the skyline.
Visitors can also ride the old Jenny rail cars with their antique Model A Ford gas engines, used in the past like little trolley cars to bring food and supplies out to the crews. You can check out the Thornberry Museum, an 1856 homestead cabin that now houses nearly century-old memories. But what you're sure to remember the most are the steam whistles of the old shays. Long and lonesome reminders that the good old days are hiding in the shadows of these pines.
There are some layouts that look like toy trains, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have this. Welcome to the Ironhead Timber Company, logging in the Great Pacific Northwest, early 1900s. It's the creation of Texan Bob Clark, a former Air Force Chief Master Sergeant who came up with the idea when he was stationed in Washington State more than 25 years ago. He fell in love with the rugged beauty of the Northwest scenery and in love with the romance of old-time logging railroads.
The logging operations appeal to me because it excludes all the nitpickers. If it happened to work in a prototype, welding, any way they could make it work, well, they did it. Just to get the timber out of the woods to the landing so they could take it to the mill. They would go into the woods, fallers use the axes and saws to knock the trees down, then the buckers would cut it to length, and they'd use cables and donkeys and horses and any other means to get the logs to a site so they could load them.
As you can see, what makes this layout so eye-catching is Bob's attention to detail. Where the rolling stock seems right in place amid the tall trees and against the majestic backdrop. The jagged rocks look like jagged rocks. The trees look like trees. This is the work of a master. Let's get some tips from a pro.
The rock formations are built following many of the Kalmbach books. What I do a little bit different than anyone else does in a rock thing is I paint in shadows to add the third dimension. And I'll point this out right here. Right in here, I'll take and paint this a little bit darker so that it pops out the face and recedes the shadow. Other than that, if you follow the Kalmbach instructions, they will give you ample instruction how to do it. One of my favorite things to use for all my wooden structures is take Floquill's driftwood and stain all my wood and let it cure for a week at a minimum. Then I go back and use diluted colors, whichever, like red, green, whatever the color may be, and I flow it on real thin, and it gives a real faded look. And then as I finish it off, I'll use chalks, specifically along the bottom to show where mud is splashed up on it from the rains. Now the tar paper or corrugated roofing, I use chalks to weather them also. I'd like to show you the variety of the trees that we have on the Ironhead Timber Company. The first one here I'll show you is a store-bought tree that I've used hairspray on it and covered it with ground foam. The next type of tree that I build is from 4x4 cedar posts, old ones, and I taper them off in a sander and drill them out, and the limbs are broom straws covered with woodland seedings foliage material. The next type of tree is the same type of trunk from a 4x4 cedar post and use an asparagus fern, and again I coat it with hairspray and ground foam. Now not all trees are live and green. Here's an example. This is a stalk from out of my alley, the rear of my home, and this is another type of dead tree. This is a Pride of Madeira from California, which is a flower, and the buds have been taken off from it. So as you can see, there's quite a variety of trees that one can put on his layout, and they still tie in together.
What's also unique about this layout is something you might not have noticed: an optical illusion to force the perception of the viewer. Bob uses two different gauges, larger in the foreground, smaller in the background.
I have two different gauges on the Ironhead Timber Company. The primary reason is I had such an investment in HO. I was in HO scale for about 30 years. But I got interested in O scale because Mr. Lowell Joyner, a good friend of mine here in San Antonio, twisted my arm. In fact, I still have the black and blue marks. So how do you put the two scales on one railroad? Well, alas, I found out that the distance between the rail heads was very insignificant. So I used HO standard gauge on the top, and I use O narrow gauge on the bottom. And they are tied together. You can see that the distance from the O scale to where the HO is about 18 to 20 inches. And they're tied together with trees. How tall is a tree? It can be O scale or HO.
And so as the sun sets on the Ironhead Timber Company, we feel comfortable saying it's one of the best we've seen. And Bob Clark, quite simply, is the reason why.
Just because your layout scene is complete doesn't mean you can't go back at a later date to add additional details. Today I'm going to be adding some additional details to our popular Turtle Creek Central Project Railroad. I'll be adding some decals and weathering with pastel chalks. First, we're going to add a decal to the side of one of the downtown buildings to give it a little more character. Since we'll be adding a decal to a building that's already weathered, I'm going to cut the decal as close as possible to the graphics. You'll notice that I cut the decal out on an old piece of glass. It provides a nice, solid surface to give a sharp edge on the decal. Let me show you how easy this technique is. I take my pastel chalk and lightly drag a hobby knife down the side of it. With the dust created, I now take an old paintbrush, dab it in the chalk, and take that chalk dust to my decal. You can do several layers, so try not to get too much on at one time. With the chalk in place, I now grab Tester's Dull Coat, which you can use either out of the aerosol can or airbrush, and lightly mist the front of the decal. Don't use too much or it'll create lumps. If you're happy with the first layer of chalk, you can stop there. Or after the dull coat has dried after a few minutes, you can add another layer of chalk and seal it again with dull coat. The great thing about weathering with pastel chalks is that you can add multiple layers of different colors to go for different effects. For example, I'll now use a lighter gray to make the sign appear as though it's not only dirty, but faded. Now that the decal weathering is dry, we're going to apply it to the side of the building. Insert the decal into the water. You may notice that some of the chalk will come off, but that's okay. We've got a couple of coats on there, so we should still have enough left over. I usually let my decals soak for a good minute before I pull them out of the water and place it on a napkin. I'll let it soak there, and while it's soaking, I'll add a decal setting solution to the side of the building where the decal will be applied. This will help adhere the decal to the side of the structure. Now I carefully grab the decal, make sure it's sliding. Yep, it's sliding on the paper, so I can grab it, slide it off with a pin. Be careful not to tear the decal. Position it so it's straight. And now I can take my napkin and get any excess water off the side of the model, and to make sure there aren't any air bubbles underneath the decal. I can then go back with my water, or clean my brush that had been in that decal solution, use the second step of the decal setting solution on top of the decal. Lightly apply it and let it dry before you touch the decal. The decal might slide around a little bit on the first application, but get it back where you'd like it and let that dry without touching it, because the decal will become very fragile once you put that on. If you happen to get an air bubble underneath your decal, you can take a pin and gently poke a hole in the decal. And then apply another coat of the decal setting solution. The little hole that you poked will allow the setting solution to get behind the decal and should help the decal lay down. With the structure back in place, you can see how the weathered decal adds a little more character to the scene. Another great application for pastel chalks is to go back to a structure that you don't really like how the original weathering technique turned out. The dairy on the Turtle Creek Central, for example, has a very shiny roof that I'd like to tone down a little bit with a couple layers of pastel chalks. I'll start with a brown chalk to kind of mute the roof a little bit. Using the same technique, take my hobby knife, and this time I need to scrape off a lot because I'm doing the entire roof. Grab the chalk with the brush and lightly start applying it to the roof. Making sure not to get it on the front of the building. And now with the chalk in place, I can use a dull coat to give it a light mist to seal it. Now once that dull coat dries, I can go back and add another layer, this time black, to give it a little more muted tones. Now if there's any windows or any nearby structures when you're doing this, you might want to mask them off or protect them with cardboard. In this instance, we've pulled the structure off of the layout to protect the other details on the layout. Now we'll give that a couple of minutes to dry before we add another layer of chalk. I could use just straight black chalk for my second coat, but I think I'll tone it down a little bit by mixing it with the brown chalk that I already have in my box. It's another great feature of using pastel chalks. You can mix the colors together to create any color you'd like. Once it's mixed, simply apply it to the roof. And if you'd like, you can create darker areas like the previous weathering job had done. around the chimney. Now with the chalk applied, I can give one more light misting of dull coat to seal it all in. With the second layer of chalk and dull coat in place and dry, you can see that our roof now looks much more realistic by not being so shiny. Here are a couple of other areas on a structure that you can use pastel chalks to weather. Use black around a chimney to simulate soot, down the valley of the roof, and around the gutters and downspouts you could use an orange color to simulate rust. As long as you're willing to try new techniques, your layout will be a constantly evolving group of scenes that change with your taste over the course of time. I've just shown you a couple of ways to use pastel chalks to weather your layout. There's an endless variety of ways you can use this technique to weather locomotives, rolling stock, and structures. Be willing to experiment and have fun.
Here's train number 262. It is bound for the southeast, Florida and Georgia. It has some auto parts and also returning empty cars to the southeastern part of the United States.
Welcome to Alan McClellan's world. Here, inside his basement near Dayton, Ohio, you'll find evolution of sorts. He started building models long ago, back in the 40s and 50s, but he just wasn't happy.
After building several railroads that were not successful, they just didn't do what I wanted to achieve in the feeling of a real railroad. They were just a loop of track. So in the late 50s, I started designing the Virginia and Ohio Railroad, which is a freelance railroad, and the construction actually started in November of 1961.
Freelance means he created it, thought it up. It gives him the freedom to manipulate the terrain and rails as he wishes. Yet, he says, it's based on prototype practices and theories and operates just like a real railroad.
The train that you see coming out of the tunnel is coming from the south off the Durham subdivision, which has our connections to Georgia, Florida. You'll notice the consist of the cars in the train represent products that would be coming from that part of the country.
Model railroaders have lots of choices when it comes to designing a layout. Big cities, Great Plains, along oceans. The Virginia and Ohio winds through steep mountain passes, over creeks, and through small towns.
Well, mountain railroading is the best to model, and that was one of the early decisions I made, that it would be a mountain railroad, because the mountains and the ridges and the hills, tunnels, you can hide unwanted trackage. Also, it gives you the feeling of greater distance when you don't see all of the railroad at one time and have to wander around following the train. And you can't see the next location because it's around the peninsula.
Attention to detail makes this layout one of the finest, but it's the combination of minute touches and the big picture that makes his creation so special.
It is fun to sit down and build a well-detailed model and also to work on the railroad. Some of the favorite things I enjoy in the hobby, though, is the scenery and the artistic parts of it, the weathering of the equipment and cars, and creating a miniature railroad, not a model, a real railroad is the way I feel about it.
The artistic part comes naturally to Alan McClellan. It's another of his talents that complements model railroading.
It does help. It does help because there's a certain feel that you have, and it's hard to describe when you know things look right. And that's where I have a good eye for knowing what's right and wrong in scenes and colors and the way things really look in the real world. And that's what you're recreating here in the basement.
Of course, when you're as good as he is, it's tough to keep things limited to taking up the basement. Still, he can't bring himself to expand too much.
No, the wife says I got to stay below the first floor. I wouldn't say taking it up. It has taken up the basement.
Along with the hard work of building this masterpiece, there is a lot of laughter and good times.
Well, it's been a lot of fun creating it, and I've got a lot of pleasure from it. And that's the other part of the hobby. It's a lot of fun. There's different facets that you mentioned earlier. Everything from mechanical drawing to electrical, mechanical, artistic skills, photography, all these go together in the hobby of model railroading. And I know of very few hobbies that can satisfy so many different interests and enjoyment out of it. And when I come down here and work on it, whether it's something in fine detail or just operating some of the railroad, it's very relaxing for me.
If you think this layout has reached a state of perfection, you're wrong.
You never finish a model railroad because in the original portion, I've been reworking a lot of it, bringing it up to today's standards and improving the looks and appearance. In some of it, also some of the scenery needed some improvements because of the age of it. Some of it goes back over 30 years. In fact, the railroad has been around for about 30, almost 40 years now.
And still it runs and grows and evolves with the help of its creator.
Now, this is fairly typical of the way locomotives are painted in the period from about 1960 on. Because by then the railroads were getting away from all the fancy stripes and everything and going more with using a single color for the main body and then a second color for the walkways and the running gear underneath the locomotive. Some of the paint companies have a primer color. Others, we just use something like reefer gray or any of the light gray colors, and that works just fine. The gray is usually a very finely ground pigment, and we just spray it on the entire locomotive over the hoods, walkways, and especially want to make sure we get it in around the steps and the little end platforms and stuff. You have to keep moving the model around as we go to make sure that all the areas of the details are covered. Then the last part of it, once we have the gray on, is to go with the first color, and we normally start with the lightest color first. This particular engine is one that I'm doing for a friend. It's a little different color than what I use, but the orange is still a light color that's very difficult to cover if you don't use the undercoat. We put the first or light color on the entire locomotive, and in this case we spray it on so only the areas that are going to stay orange are covered real well. You notice I haven't bothered getting it up on top of the walkways on the edge because that's going to be hidden or in the black area of the locomotive later on. The important thing about it is you want to make sure you have a nice even coat over the entire hood and that there's no black areas existing in, for example, underneath the little louvers in the side of the hood or where the hinges are. The next step is to take masking tape. I use ordinary Scotch brand masking tape. I like the regular masking tape as it's a little bit easier and a fresh roll of it is nice and flexible so it'll mold itself as we put the tape on the model. The one thing that I always do is stick it down on a piece of glass first, because then when we peel it up, it takes some of the stickiness off of the tape adhesive, so that when we put it on the model, we have less chance of lifting any of the paint from the first color off of the model. The next problem is the edge of the tape, if you look at it very closely, is a little ragged. So what I do is take a steel rule and a sharp hobby knife and just take a little thin slice off the edge of that piece of tape. And what that does is it gives me a nice clean sharp edge then when I peel the scrap out of here. So I have a nice straight edge to use when I'm masking along the side of the locomotive. If I don't do that, we wind up with a little bit of a wavy edge to it, and that's very difficult to make look good because the paint is going to be uneven at that point. Now the next step is to get the tape actually on the locomotive. And the trick here is we look for things on the prototype locomotive that also appear on the model to use to line up the stripe. In this case, I want the tape to run right along that bottom edge of the hood of the locomotive. So all I do is lay the locomotive down on its side, and I can pick up one end of the roll of a piece of tape and then just set it in there flush against the bottom of the locomotive and very gently touch it a couple places along the side just to hold it in place at this point. Now, to get this bottom edge down so the paint won't blow under it, I just take an ordinary screwdriver. This happens to be one of the little mini screwdrivers we use for everything else. This one is an older one that's been worn a little bit, so the edges are a little rounded on it. And it works real well, because then all I have to do is hold the model down and take the screwdriver and run it right along that bottom edge. And just carefully press the tape down as I go. And that tape will move right in tight against the bottom edge of the locomotive. Now, on the back side, I brought the tape across the end of the locomotive, and we bring that in tight like it should be. And then on this side, I just angle it up out of the way, because we're going to have a fresh piece of tape running down here. And the same thing on the back. We just bring it around. There's going to be a locomotive cab on the back part of this engine, so we don't have to even worry about where that's going. The only thing is we want to make sure the tape is not out on the platform, or it'll keep us from getting black paint where we need it. We bring in the second one. Same as before, we lightly touch it down. We don't have to worry about having the middle part of the tape real stuck to the model, because all that's for is to keep the paint from hitting the surface. And once again, we just take the screwdriver and real gently work along this edge, bring the tape in where it belongs. And if the tape doesn't look like it's going where it should be, there's nothing wrong with lifting it off and positioning it a second time. And then on the back, we bring this around and bring it up a little bit as we did before, and that gets the whole back end of the locomotive, and we now have the entire hood covered up. But before we can do any spraying though, we need to cover the rest of the hood, or we'll have paint blowing up on top where we don't want it. And now we go through and make sure that joint is sealed between the two pieces of tape, because if it isn't sealed nice and tight, you're going to have paint blowing under there. So now we have the whole main body of the locomotive masked off and ready for the black paint application. Now the first thing I'm going to do is take a little bit more of the same orange paint that I used for the area that's covered with masking tape now. And what I'm going to do is spray a little bit of it along the edge of the tape where this tape joins the body that's going to be painted black later on. And what this little spray of the orange paint is going to do is seal this edge, so if there are any little spots where paint can blow under it or anything, this will seal it with orange paint that isn't going to show. Then when I put the black on, the orange paint blocks the black from going where it doesn't belong. And it's a little trick that the advanced modelers have used for years, but I've never seen it written up very often. So we'll take a little bit of this orange. We start spraying beyond the model and come back across that area, just catching that bottom of the model all the way across. And we go, start it beyond the model, go across the model, and then stop. Okay, now when we start spraying, we're going to be doing several light passes and gradually build up the color. And the reason we do a number of light passes is to keep from getting too much paint blowing into the dead-end corners in the model, filling them with paint and then having runs going places that we don't want them. So let's turn the spray booth on, and we'll start spraying. We'll work down the side, and I'll carry it right across the end. And you can see there's still little corners in here that aren't getting hit with paint. So what I'll do is keep changing the angle that I'm spraying from so that eventually I get paint blown into all those areas. And we just keep working around the model working from end to end. And then when we start getting to where there's little areas like the step well that don't have the paint in them, then we start working a little bit up and down in those areas until we get some paint to fill them. We constantly keep turning the model and doing just a little bit each time and building up the color as we go. And that way we don't have paint running, gives it a chance to dry. And if you get the light reflecting off of it, you can see whether it's got a shiny wet surface or a flatter look as it dries. And you don't want to get it too wet at any one point. You'll also notice when I tip it up, there's a lot of areas along the edges that aren't painted yet. So this is part of it. We've got to tip it up as well as down in order to get paint into all the details. And we hit the pilot going up a little bit. We'll turn it around, do the next side. Second pilot. Now we go up on top again and we start spraying down on the walkways. Across the ends. Down the second walkway. And keep rotating the model as you do it, putting a little paint on each time. And then before you put the airbrush away, be sure to take a close look at it. I usually take it under a real bright light so I can see color reflected. Like at this end, I can tell that this corner is a little bit lighter than everything else on the model. So what I'll do is just take the airbrush and we'll work this corner just a few more passes and get it nice and dark just like the rest of them. Now at this point, the model has had about a half hour or so to dry, which lets the paint set up nice and hard. So you just take a pair of tweezers and use fingers or whatever is handy and start peeling the tape off in the same basic order that it went on, because that way you get one layer at a time coming off of the model. The one thing you need to be careful of is that you don't pull it right off of the base piece here. So now we're down to the last couple pieces that went on. And this time, so that we don't scar up the edge here, we want to pull off to the side at about a 45-degree angle. And you can see I'm making a real tight radius where the tape is coming off of the model, but at the same time I'm pulling away from the black color, the second color that went on it. And what this does is it keeps from chewing up the fine line where the two colors meet. We just turn it over and keep right on coming around. And then once the paint is all off, there's the finished two-color paint scheme. After the decals have been put on the engine, then I go back and use a paintbrush to touch up things like the little railing along the side of the hood, the corner railings, and then I add a little bit of weathering to the model to make it look like it's been running and used. And by weathering, what I do is take a little bit of a sandy color or dust color and spray just a little bit of that along the trucks, fuel tank, and running gear of the locomotive. And what that does is it highlights all these neat little details in the side frames and brings them out so people can see them. If you don't do that, it makes the engine look like it's floating on a black shadow and you don't see all this neat stuff underneath. Then I take a little bit of the grimy black color and spray that along the top to represent the soot that blows out of the two stacks on the engine. And depending on whether it's pushing or pulling, the pattern of the soot that blows out of it either blows forward and down on the radiators here, or it goes toward the back across the top of the cab. And that's done by just taking the airbrush and putting a real light dusting of black across the top. And then on the end of the unit, I put a little bit of a spray on each side here to represent the dirt that the wheels of the car that it's pulling throw up in the rainstorms. And that makes the engine look much more realistic because you can see more of the detail on it than you can if you just leave it in the plain color.
This railroad is a work of art in the making for the past 20 years. Jim Strong is the artist. Strong is a self-made model railroader, as well as an amateur landscape architect. But looking at this layout, maybe amateur is the wrong word. Expert might be a better choice. His woodland railway is not only large, but also absolutely fascinating to look at. Altogether, it probably measures out at about 150 feet by 150 feet. It's laid out in two main sections. There's the section that was built in the woods behind his house. That came first. A few years later, the side yard portion was added.
Once I did get some track down, then I started thinking about, well, what do I want to put around it? And so as time went on, first of all, I was getting plants, and I killed plenty of them, trying to get them to grow in the shade. But eventually, I found the ones that would survive. They didn't have to grow, they just had to survive. And that's where we got to the yews and the little cedar trees you see here and things like that. I found moss that grows really well here and does a good job of keeping erosion down. And I found the plants, and then to keep it sort of, I always wanted to keep an eastern flavor to it, so that's why I went to the kind of rocks I have here, rather than yellow or red rocks that are typical of the West. So these are basically Pennsylvania fieldstone, which, you know, come from Pennsylvania. I would guess that I've used about 3 or 4 or 5 tons of rocks so far.
Some of the same things that make Jim Strong's layout so impressive are the suggestions he would offer to anyone considering such an undertaking. Make sure you have a strong theme. The railroad has got to be as much fun to look at as it is to operate. Different things can help accomplish this. Make sure there's a certain amount of visual isolation in your design so that the entire railway can't all be seen at once.
And I like it where I have to walk around to see everything, just like on the real railroad. If you flew over one in a helicopter, you couldn't see the whole line at one time. They go through trees and through mountains and things like that. So that's a kind of visual barrier that I wanted to have on the railroad. So I've planted trees, for one thing, and large bushes. The trains go through around hills that I've built up out of as rock and stone. They go through tunnels, anything to isolate one area from another and force you to walk around to see everything that there's there to see.
Jim suggests that a layout design be as natural as possible, just like it is in a prototype. Let it follow a natural path and the path of least grade and least resistance. Build it like they'd build a real railroad. One thing you might want to do is build on a raised planter. It's easier to see, and it's easier on your back, not as much bending over. And when you design your layout, make sure you provide for lots of easy access, as well as operating flexibility. It's no fun if you can't get to the parts of the layout you want to work on.
I'd advise people who are starting out to start with something very small in an area that they think they might want to build their railroad in, and then expand from there. Don't try to do it all at once. Don't try to plan everything out on paper first. You might have plans on paper, but don't try to do it all at one time. You'll find that you try to build too much, you'll get frustrated, and you'll never get done. But if you have a chance to start small, you'll see what you like, you'll find out what you like, and you can go from there.
And just listening to the names of the towns here, Hemlock Hill, Tall Oaks, Willow Flats, and Woodland Junction, give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of plantings Jim likes to use.
Up in the woods, I found that yews will survive nicely. Actually, they'll grow. Then azaleas grow well in the woods. They're a shade plant. They don't necessarily bloom up there, but they do grow and survive. There's a arborvitae that seems to grow well in the shade, although most people think of them as growing strictly as sunshine plants. But it's funny, there's one that has a vertical leaf and then another one that has a horizontal leaf. And the one with the horizontal leaves, I guess that catch the sun better, do well in a partial shade. And they'll basically survive. Then there are boxwoods, American boxwood and English boxwoods that seem to do well.
On the Woodland Railway, the big details are pretty noticeable. But if you look closely, you'll see that just as much attention is paid to the little details. Realistic, real-life scenes. Social vignettes, Jim likes to call them. Just little reminders that this fantasy land is not that far from reality.
An important part of building a model railroad is having a good track plan to start with. Some modelers are so excited about getting into the hobby that they build a layout right away in their basement without any real thought of what they want to do. And that can be great to get started, but it can lead to a lot of frustration later on. I am an advocate of having a firm track plan and knowing how it's going to fit in your basement before you take and build the railroad. What I have here is a model of my model railroad. Actually, it's a model of my basement and my model railroad. And it shows the relationship of the layout within the given space. Now, it looks like there's a lot of space, but that means I have plenty of room to take and expand the railroad when we get over to this section here. Building a model of your model railroad is actually a very smart idea. It allows you to take and see how the layout will fit into the given space, but it also allows you to take and do things like test your aisle widths to see how people will relate to the railroad in general. I've actually built a model railroad before without making a 3D plan, and unfortunately, I wound up being about a foot short. And so instead of having to add on more basement, I wound up taking apart a lot of bench work. To design a model railroad, it doesn't take a heck of a lot of skill, but you need some important tools. One of which is a tape measure. A tape measure to take and measure your basement space to figure out where your pipes and support columns and things are so that they appear accurately on your track plan and you don't wind up building your model railroad and suddenly realizing that, oh, the furnace is in the way, for example. Another important tool for model railroading track planning is a good pencil. I use mechanical pencils because they have always a sharp tip and it makes for very neat, firm lines. There are a couple of ways that you can take and draw curves on a track plan. One is using a compass. Compass is a drafting tool used for making circles, and it's great for making curves on your model railroad track plan. You can also use templates. These happen to be made by a company called Method Inc., and these are predetermined radii of circles for track planning as well. Not quite as flexible as a compass, but when you know you need a 20-degree radius, you got it right here. And the other important piece for track planning is graph paper. This is just an ordinary sheet of graph paper. If you're working with a larger plan, you probably need more of it, but you can easily take and just tape sheets together and go from there. Scale is an important thing to consider when drawing a model railroad track plan. For the model that I've got here and my track plan for my layout, I've drawn it to a 1/2 inch scale, which means 1/2 inch equals 1 foot of actual model railroad. You can draw track plans to various scales. 1/2 inch to the foot is probably a comfortable scale for making small size plans, but if you really want to have a good idea of how your tracks are going to fit in relation with each other and how the buildings will interact with the model railroad, you probably want to consider 3/4 inches to a foot or 1 inch to a foot being a good standard. Choosing a scale for your track plan is a very important thing for another reason, because you also get scale people to fit within it. And that's going to be key for making our 3-dimensional model railroad. This is a 1/24 scale figure, which is 1/2 inch equals a foot again. And she is approximately 5 foot 6 inches tall, which is an average height for a human being. Once you've gotten your track plan drawn, as I've got here, The next thing you want to do is make some photocopies of it, because we're going to have to cut it up in order to make the 3D model. And you don't ever want to cut up an original track plan because duplicating it is an awful lot of work. So I've got some photocopies here that I've already made. Photocopies of the track plan are fairly plain to look at, and so I like to spruce them up a bit by coloring them. You can use markers or other things. I like colored pencils because they're easy to work with and they don't typically bleed through the paper like a marker can. I usually start by choosing a blue and coloring in all of the waterway features on the layout. So I've got part of a river here that runs through. And you can see that the colors have already then separated your water features from the rest of the railroad. Another thing I'll do is take and color in roads. Typically I'll use a brown or a gray pencil. This particular one happens to be gray. And you can see that the track plan, once we've done this, is already starting to become highlighted. You want to keep the rail areas kind of white with the black lines on them so they're easy to follow. Green is another great color for just filling in some of the scenery. I'll usually take areas like this and start by making heavy green dots just to simulate some trees. And then lightly sketch in some more of the surrounding undergrowth and grass. So you can see with a little effort, this corner of the model railroad is already starting to look like something completely different than just a photocopy of the track plan. Once you've got the layout colored, then it's time to take and mount it to the foam core, the material we're going to use to build the 3D layout. Foam core is an art board. It's got a styrofoam interior, and then it's wrapped on both sides with paper, which makes it easy to cut, gives it some rigidity so it can stand up on its own better than cardboard would, and it's got a nice smooth surface for working on. Mount the track plan to the foam core using just an ordinary glue stick, though you could use photo mount as well for something like this if you happen to have a can handy. White glue is something you don't want to use for this project because it will take and cause the paper of your track plan to ripple, and it won't add for a very nice looking finished model when you're done. Take and line up one edge and then smooth it out to avoid getting any creases or ripples. Once you have the track plan mounted to the foam core, it's time to take and cut it out so that we can take and build the 3D model of the layout with it. I start by using a straight edge to take and make cuts along the sides of the layout. To cut the foam core, I use a hobby knife. The important thing to remember is to use a sharp blade when working with foam core. If you have a knife blade that is dull, it will usually snag the foam in between the layers of the paper and can cause the foam core to tear, which will make jagged edges and a rather unappealing finished model when you're done. Start by laying the straight edge along one side of the layout. Hold it in place firmly with your hand, keeping your fingers out of the knife path, of course. And then make a light score of the knife just to cut through the first layer of the paper before you make any deeper cuts. This will ensure that you've got the line where you want it to be, as well as make sure that you get a clean cut when you're finished. Then make a second pass, push the knife in deeper, following your straight edge. And then your final cut should cut right through the bottom paper layer. And then separate your foam core. So we have one edge of the layout done. Work your way around until you've finished. Once the layout is cut out, it's time to give it that 3D quality by adding the legs and the backdrops. Layout height is a personal choice. I'm 6 feet tall and my layout is 42 inches because that's a comfortable height for me to work on the model railroad. Some people prefer to take and have the layout at eye level so that they can see the trains as though they're a rail fan watching it in real life. To elevate the layout, we'll take and add pieces of foam core underneath it. In order to make a layout 42 inches high in half-inch scale, that would be approximately 1 3/4 inches. And so what I've done is I've taken and pre-cut some pieces to fit under the model railroad. As you can see here, they're just simply glued at appropriate points to support. I didn't bother to model the benchwork as I would when I'm building the model railroad, because I'm really just making this model to see how it will fit in the basement and how people will interact with it, not necessarily as a design for the support structure itself. In addition to building the benchwork legs then, I've also made backdrop pieces for the Model 2. Adding backdrops to the model is an important feature because a lot of time backdrops are used as view blocks, keeping people from being able to see what's on the other side of the model railroad. And this makes your model railroad actually seem a lot larger than it really is. I made the backdrops for this model using a piece of shirt cardboard, the white cardboard that comes within a shirt package usually, because it's thin enough to take and bend easily to make nice curves, as you can see here, but also rigid enough that it stands up by itself. Once the model of the model railroad is finished, it's time to actually build the basement or the room that the railroad will fit into. When building the model of the basement itself, it's important to have the key pieces that go in the basement, like the support columns and any water pipes and things, as well as the stairway. Now, I made the stairway for this basement to be removable because I wanted to be able to see into the layout and find out how it's going to look from a person's eye level. The support posts and the plumbing structures inside the basement are made from styrene parts. These are just pieces of styrene tubing and a piece of styrene wire used to represent my water pipe that comes into the house over on the side. These are important features to put into a model because you really need to know how the layout will fit around them and how people will have to move around them as well. Once you finish building the basement, then it's a simple fact of adding the model railroad to it. We'll take and set our railroad in here, nestle it in around its pipes and support posts, and then we can take and add the people. Place them in aisleways, check clearances between the layout and the support posts to make sure that they can get through, and we can put our stair back in as well. Another advantage of building a three-dimensional model of your model railroad is to get a human-level view of what it will look like when it's finished. By making the stairs removable, I can take and look into the area of the basement where the model railroad is and see how it looks from a person's perspective. I can also move the people around and get an idea whether the view blocks will work or not. Building a 3D model of your model railroad is a smart idea. It allows you to see if your track plan will accurately fit in the space that you have available or not. And it'll save you a lot of frustration down the road when you know that what you're building for benchwork will fit in the basement that you have. Making a model of your model railroad takes about an evening or two to do, and it's an easy project. Good luck.
So what's the easiest way to get from one side of a mountain to the other? Well, it's not the easiest way, but one way is to blast a big hole right through the middle of the mountain. And that's what was done here in the Cascades. Neither the trains that roll through what is called Stevens Pass, nor the people who ride these trains can fully comprehend the engineering brilliance that went into creating this wonder. The first and smaller tunnel was completed by the Great Northern Railroad back in 1900. It shortened the climb over the Cascades as the train made its way from St. Paul to Seattle to meet with the Pacific Ocean. It was a 2.5-mile tunnel, but there were demons in the darkness. At times, especially if a train stalled, the smoke from the trains would accumulate in the tunnel, choking the trains to a stop and the people on board them to death from asphyxiation. So they electrified the tunnel, doing away with the need to burn fuel. But that did nothing to stop the massive snowslides near the summit, and in 1910, the Wellington disaster.
Snowfall has always been a major problem for the Great Northern in the Cascades. Wellington was a little town at the west portal of the first Cascade Tunnel. 2 trains had been stalled by heavy snowfall up there on March 1st, 1910. Suddenly the mountain let go and the snowslide swept both trains down the mountain. Approximately 96 people were killed.
It was clear the climb would have to be reduced even more, but a tunnel farther down would be much longer, and it was a job some thought impossible. Finally, in 1925, the construction began. The tunnel would be 3 times as long, nearly 8 miles. It would reduce the strenuous climb for the trains by yet another 500 feet. 5 million pounds of dynamite was used to blast a hole in the mountain, and 1 million cubic yards of rock were hauled out. 3 years and $26 million later, it was the longest tunnel in the Western Hemisphere.
During the construction of the new 8-mile tunnel, the surveyors were so accurate that they got the alignment within 9 inches over the 8-mile length.
This tunnel too was electrified, but when electric gave way to diesel, old demons came back. Walt Grasula was an electrical engineer for the Great Northern.
They started with the electrics running the electrics through, and they had a catenary system all the way through the tunnel. So they could run electrics. Electrics could pull steam engines through if they had to, because steam was still in operation. It hadn't been phased out yet for the diesels. But the only way that you could run the diesels through after a while was to ventilate the tunnel. And the idea behind ventilating the tunnel was to provide clean air with oxygen for the diesel locomotives, and also to remove the exhaust fumes from the diesels as the train is progressing through the tunnel. You don't want the engines to overheat.
When the railroad dieselized in about 1956, they found that the fumes in the tunnel from the diesel locomotives working upgrade could not be handled without some special ventilation system. So they put doors on the east end of the tunnel, massive fans in a ventilation shaft directly above the tunnel at the highest point. And they close these doors when an eastbound train is working upgrade, push air against the train so that the diesel engines and the crew have air to work with. At the end of, after a train has gone through the tunnel, then they close the door again and pump the tunnel out. This takes about 20 minutes after each train goes through.
Finally, there was comfort and safety in the tunnel. John Strauss was a traveling passenger representative for the Great Northern's empire builder through the 1950s and 1960s, and has taken the ride through the tunnel darkness more than 1,000 times.
And I would go through here every 8 days as part of my job as traveling passenger representative, and each time we went through it was different, entirely different. Different conditions, weather conditions. Sometimes it'd be raining, pouring, sometimes it'd be snowing, sometimes it'd be beautiful sunshine. So it was as interesting to us on the crew to watch, to see the scenery as it was for the passengers. They were fascinated by going through as it is today with the snow during the winter months, and we would point out to them that they were in the longest tunnel in the North American continent at that time. Since that time, of course, the Rogers Tunnel in Canada has been built, which exceeds the mileage of the Cascade.
500,000 trains have crossed Stevens Pass over the past century, climbing up the mountain and then going right through its middle. It is a monument to the ingenuity of man. And when the headlight comes piercing out of the nothingness of the tunnel, what once seemed impossible now seems deceptively routine.
In Tom Wilson's mind, this is not a model of the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railroad. It is the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railroad. The lush, hilly countryside of western Pennsylvania is the setting. You must forget momentarily that the real setting is his entire garage. His interest in the line began when he was just a young boy spending time at a vacation cabin near the main line. It matured during the years he worked for U.S. Steel, when he often saw the real cars. He models a very specific time, right down to the day after the Pittsburgh and West Virginia was taken over by the Norfolk and Western, October 17th, 1964.
I picked October 17, 1964, the day after the merger of the Norfolk Western into the Pittsburgh and West Virginia and the Nickel Plate and the other railroads. It gives me the flexibility to run Norfolk and Western equipment along with Pittsburgh and West Virginia. They had a very colorful paint scheme on their engines, and it also for modelers in the area. I have a few friends which we interchange with, and it's kind of fun to do it that way. Nobody nitpicks me to death on it too. I've had visitors who lived along the Pittsburgh and West Virginia come in, down to the house to see the railroad. I had one particular gentleman come in and saw Castle Shannon, and he just was floored by it and thought it was very, thought it was every building there. I've taken a little bit of liberty to make the buildings as close as I can to the prototype and still have the feel of the area. The flexibility comes in our operating sessions. You may see Susquehanna engines running. You'll see when my operators come, we change equipment around. It gives us a little bit of flexibility into it. We have fun, and we're not a die-hard operating group, and we have fun up here. Everybody's cutting down on one another, just having a lot of good fun. And there are a bunch of good guys. I have about 15 guys that come in. We have a lot of fun doing it. AJ12, the Yardmaster.
Rook Yardmaster, got AJ12.
Consist on AJ12, please.
You have 12 cars.
Clearance to leave Rook Yard, please.
AJ12, you're clear to depart Rook Yard. Contact the dispatcher.
Thank you, Yardmaster. AJ12 is leaving.
The trains run according to actual timetables of the original, with through freights using the same designations as their prototypes, waybills and all. The pictures he takes on yearly trips to Pennsylvania may explain why the structures and the scenery look so real. When he goes on those trips, he also takes measurements of the many things that occupy the P&WV right-of-way and lands nearby. So yes, everything is about as exact as it could possibly be. The wood structures are mostly scratch-built. The brick and masonry buildings are modified kits. Let's talk again about attention to detail. Tom even adds texture to the base plaster by mixing in a little sifted western Pennsylvania dirt. And look at all the trees and brush. So real, it's picture perfect.
I like to use two different techniques in making trees on the railroad. One is I use poly foam, which you can get at any arts and crafts store. What you do is you just ball it up like this. So you get a ball about that size. And what I do is I usually put it in a box like this. And just some green old cheap spray paint. And spray it green. And just cover it real well so you don't see any of the white. They let that dry. After it dries, then you get these nice little poly balls. I use spray glue. This is a 3M, any kind will work, and just hit it. Do this outside. Spray glue is very toxic. And what you do is you just take this ball and put it in, this is coarse, medium green ground foam. I've tried all different, you can use dark green, you can use light green, and you get a nice little puff ball like this. The other material I like to use is real weeds. Go outside, take a walk. When you're doing it, I use a lot of goldenrod. This is just a plain old weed. It's naturally colored, so you don't have to do anything with it. Just hit it with a little bit of spray glue. Again, dump it in the coarse ground foam. If you need a little more, just hit it with a little more spray glue. Sometimes you do. And those will be planted on the railroad.
As you can see, Tom Wilson knows how to make things look real. If you didn't know any better, you'd believe this was a real railroad, just like Tom Wilson believes it is.
We're going to talk about operating a model railroad, running a layout as if it was actually carrying freight. I think of this as what a model railroad is for. This is what you do with it after you build it. Even a small layout like this Turtle Creek Central has lots of operating opportunities. We're going to demonstrate running a local freight out from our little yard to a mine branch, exchanging some empty cars for loaded coal hoppers, and then bringing them back to the terminal. Start with our locomotive moving slowly out of the track where it spent the night. Past the first switch here. The switches are all operated manually, which is typical of layouts that do a lot of switching operation. And also we're running the locomotive very slowly. This is low-speed yard track. We don't do things in a big hurry. And stop before the grade crossing. There's no gates or other protection here, so we want to make sure we're safe to go across. And continue on to get our cars. The deliberate speed is for safety in this kind of service. Take it easy across the road again. Our layout here is set in the 1950s, so we're still using a caboose as a shelter and office for the train crew. We have two men who ride in the rear, the conductor and the flagman. Modern railroads are not using cabooses anymore, so you wouldn't see this kind of a car on the train, except in certain circumstances where they have to make long backing moves and things like that. There's still a few cabooses around, but they're a rarity these days. Most model railroaders enjoy having them, though. We've got our train ready to proceed out onto our main line, which on this layout is a loop around the table. So we'll pull out of the yard. On a small layout with a loop of track as the main line like this one, we don't have a very long run for our train, but we can make it longer by running loops around the main line. You can call this adding mileage to the run or whatever. And some people would even have a set number of laps that they would make before they would stop at the next station to do some switching. We'll stop and let our brakeman throw the switch. The track arrangement that we have here with siding with switches at both ends forms what we call a runaround track. It lets us run the locomotive from one end of the train to the other so that we can pull cars when we want to and push cars when we want to get where we need to go. There's an empty car ahead of us at the fuel dealer, and we want to take that back with us, but we have to get it out of the way first. We'll come in and couple to it. And now we need to line the switch to go in behind the caboose. Come into the siding again. Couple to the train. Line the switch to the spur. And now we're ready to go all the way to the mine. The reason for making the long shove is that there's no way to get the engine on the other end of the train out at the mine. So we have to go in here set up to do the moves that we want to make, and then we'll be able to come out in the proper order. Now we push our train across the Turtle Creek Bridge. Make a stop here. The grade crossing while we get the switch lined. So we shove these two empties into the mine. Notice that the two loads are positioned with one car loaded out in front and the other loaded car under the tipple. A mine like this would only load one car at a time, the car that's under the tipple. So the cars have to be left in the right positions. Leave our empties there just for now. I'll uncouple the cars from the engine and offset the couplers so that they don't close. That's called delayed uncoupling, meaning we can push the empty hopper and caboose down into the storage track and then reverse out of there and leave them. And that'll be where we build our train to go home. Now we'll come in on the mine spur again and pull everything out. We'll take our two loaded cars, put them on top of the empty in the caboose, and that'll be our train for the return trip. Again, I'll set the couplers in that offset or delayed position here. Now as I spot the two empties for loading at the mine, I'll put them in the reverse position of the way the loads were when we arrived. There'll be one car out behind the mine and one car under the tipple to be loaded. And when the mine gets that first car loaded, they would use a cable on a winch or maybe a bulldozer to push the two cars down to where they could load the next one. While we were switching back and forth across the road here, we would have left one of our crewmen to flag the traffic on the highway to make sure we could go back and forth safely without interrupting our switching. Now we have the train put back together, and many model railroaders would pause at this point, allow some time when the crew would couple up the air hoses and make an air test to make sure that the air brakes were working through the train and it was safe to proceed home. We'll pull our train out with our 2 loaded cars and our 1 empty and head for home. Running with the engine backwards like this, the cab leading, wouldn't be a problem at all. Switch engines like this don't care which way they're going, and they really have good visibility in both directions. From this point, after the switch is lined back to the main line, we'll take our train around the loop, as many laps as we'd like to make, and tie up back at the yard where we started out. We'll use our runaround track to get the engine back around to the other end of the cars. We'll put away the 2 loads and the empties on that outer track, which we use as an interchange connection to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Those cars will be taken off to be the loads to be delivered and the empty to be loaded at a mine somewhere else. And then the caboose and the locomotive would be spotted back where they started the day. And that would be the end of a day's work on the Turtle Creek.
Look around. Almost everywhere you look is another train. Dave Watson has as many as 10 running at once and hundreds in his collection. Why so many?
Every train set has some sort of a mystique to me. And if I see one and I want to share in that mystique with it, I'll buy it. Yes, I do have a lot of sets, and I've been collecting for 40 years. So, and I practically have everything in the catalogs that I ever wanted.
These trains mean more to him than you might think.
They're toys. That's the definition of them. However, when I see an old toy train at a train meet or swap meet, and it looks decent, and I'm thinking about buying it, I buy it, and then I have this imagination where I can see a young child who had this back in the years when it came out and thought it was the best thing he ever had in his toy armamentarium. And so every one of these, I sort of imagine a youngster playing with them.
Every kid has dreams of special trains. Dave was no different. Growing up in the Midwest, his favorite was a local attraction.
My number one is the Hiawatha. That was a train that I used to watch when I lived in the city of Wauwatosa, come through and stop at the station and then take off. And it was just so dramatic, because you could be standing there 6 feet away from the train. And it was just something that was, well, it was my favorite train. And so I have a lot of Hiawatha memorabilia, and I have some Hiawatha engines, and I'll go from there.
The indoor-outdoor carpeting under the tracks doesn't look unusual, but Dave was one of the first people to use it for layouts.
Because originally we used to have to put different layers on, and then they would put a foam rubber layer on to sound deaden, and then we'd paint it, and it just got so nicked up and so messed up that I said there's got to be a better way. And I happened to stumble across this particular blend of colors in this indoor-outdoor carpeting, and I said, boy, that sure looks like grass to me.
His love for toy trains has been passed on to his son John, but it didn't start out as a hobby.
When John was in kindergarten, I got a report back from the school saying he was having some difficulty with his small muscle control of his hands and fingers. And I found that very hard to believe, so I said, well, we're going to do some therapy here. I figured if he can learn how to put track together and couple cars and put the cars on the tracks, that would certainly be a real good therapy for him. So I went right out and bought a train. And that's how we started.
All the kids from the school would always be here after school every day playing with the trains.
All the mothers from my class would say, "Is my son there?" My mom would say, "Yes."
The motor problems, if there ever were any, went away as fast as his love for trains came on strong. With that came a stronger bond between father and son.
We didn't watch a lot of television when I was younger. When Dad would get home from the office, which would be somewhat late, you know, I'd already have my PJs on, just a little guy, but we'd always spend at least an hour downstairs working on the trains. And I'd go to bed and he'd keep on working on the trains, and then I'd get up early in the morning and go down to see what he did. That was when we used to get boxes of trains from garage sales. Yeah. And they all needed repair and clean up and everything, but that was the fun of it. That's what that's really what got us together on it. And just, it was just fun. I enjoyed it. And we both enjoyed it together. So if it wasn't fun, we wouldn't have done it.
Both Dave and John are dentists. John is an innovator just like his father. He designed a critical part of the transformer that's running these trains after noticing how hot the transformer got and how slowly his trains were running.
Originally, the pickup from the coil in the transformer to the rest of the transformer was made through a carbon roller made out of graphite, like a pencil lead. And that thing was cherry red. And, you know, from my knowledge of metals and melting gold at the office, I know cherry red is about 1700 degrees. So right then and there, I thought there's a lot of resistance going there. And the hotter it got, the slower everything would go. And of course, all the energy was going to heat up the roller and not to run the trains. So I thought to myself, what could we substitute for that carbon that wouldn't wear on the soft copper coils, but would be a much better conductor? And of course, being a dentist, I thought, gold. Well, I went to the train show the next weekend and I bought a carbon roller from the supply guy, this parts guy, and I went to the office and made an impression of it. I made some little acrylic patterns and I cast a couple gold rollers up, polished them, and I brought them back and installed them in the transformers, and lo and behold, trains went faster. We could cut back the throttles. They didn't get hot.
As collections go, Dave Watson's is valuable, but it's not dollar signs he sees hanging on his walls.
No. That's strange? I don't. I just see the train that I wanted to have, that I wanted to admire, I wanted to see, I want to be able to hold. And I couldn't tell you right now what dollar I paid for any one of these.
For more than a century, a toy train has been the most exciting, the most wonderful gift a child can receive. That really goes back to the 19th century, right after real railroads began running, when small toys that children pulled or pushed on the floor made their entrance into the market. Then in the 1890s, inventors realized they could combine electricity with these toys using batteries or household current, and a new industry was born. The great electric trains that we know today really had their birth about 100 years ago, and the man we have to credit is Joshua Lionel Cowan, who took his middle name and built a marvelous company that still exists today. 100 years ago, the trains that a boy would have played with would have been large and heavy, much like this one here. This locomotive is sizable, it's hefty, and it's not at all what a real train would look like. It's very much a design of an imagination. That's because the technology didn't really exist to make a scale model of an actual locomotive. So inventors and designers took some liberties, but you can see there is still a lot on this that is exciting. The headlights work, there are places to put little flags, and it can go backwards and forwards without a hand touching it. It moves by electricity. It was a large size, what Cowan called standard gauge. Besides locomotives, Lionel and its competitors, American Flyer, Ives, and later Dorfan, produced a whole slew of passenger cars and freight cars. Here's a good example. Here's a caboose from the 1920s, the same size, equally as colorful, and still very much childlike and imaginative. How collectible are these trains today? The generations that knew them as children are elderly or have passed on, but their enthusiasm for standard gauge trains remains. And so cars and locomotives like these are valued in the hundreds, sometimes in the thousands of dollars, to individuals who are much, much younger than the trains themselves. If you look carefully at the caboose, you'll notice that it is scratched and has some dents. This detracts from its collectability. A pristine example, particularly one that had its original box, might be worth 2 or 3 times what this scratched one is. But some collectors take delight in the scratch models because they realize it shows that a child decades ago played with it and enjoyed it. Standard gauge trains remained the model well into the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. But because they were large, because they tended to be expensive, and a boy needed a large room in his home, people like Cowan and the folks at American Flyer and Ives later developed smaller trains, what we know as O gauge today, but was really known as 0 gauge. This locomotive from the 1930s is O gauge. You can see it is smaller than its standard gauge counterpart, and it has equally beautiful colors and details on it. It's very much, again, a product of someone's imagination. If you look at it carefully, you'll see how sleek and shiny it looks. This was deliberate. It was intended to model the streamlined trains that in the 1930s were capturing the imagination of Americans from coast to coast. At the end of the pre-World War II period, standard gauge was phased out and O gauge was gaining in popularity. But there were changes going on in the growing model railroad hobby. Because of changes in technology, manufacturers were able to use die-cast molding of metals and of plastics to make far more realistic models. They could also make smaller models, and this was the rise of HO, half O. There were modelers who insisted on more realistic toys and trains than they could get from Lionel or American Flyer. Compare this die-cast model of a steam locomotive to what was available in the 1930s, and you can see this is far more toy-like than this. But even this Lionel model from the late 1940s was not a scale model. So there were some members of the model railroad hobby that were moving away from toy trains into the scale side. But plenty of families were discovering the joys of giving Junior a train set on Christmas morning or for Hanukkah, and a locomotive like this one, which could now smoke and had a headlight that beamed, was exactly what every boy across America wanted. Lionel made plenty of steam locomotives, but its most popular and collectible locomotive was this beautiful model of a Santa Fe diesel. You can see how much more detailed this is. It is larger than the steam locomotive, far more detailed. It doesn't smoke, but it's got a horn and it has a headlight that works. And it is a model of what was the most popular locomotive on American rails in the post-World War II period. And so with this, Lionel expanded its line, and it worked with plastics and die-cast metals to make trains that are still popular today and very collectible. This locomotive is worth several $100s. If it had its original box and was hardly touched, it would be worth in the thousands of dollars. The same is true of steam locomotives. In addition to locomotives, Lionel was bringing out a wide array of freight cars and passenger cars in its sets. Take a look at this beauty from the mid-1950s. It looks like the wildest toy possible, but it's actually a model of what a real railroad was having on its lines. So you had beautiful freight cars, locomotives. You've also got an array of exciting accessories that load freight, move people and cows and horses and all kinds of things, signals and bridges as well. So for the young boy that wanted to, he could build his own version of the Southern Pacific Empire or the New York Central right in his basement. And best of all, he could do it with help from his father. And Lionel promoted its trains as the perfect way for fathers and sons to get to know each other and to remain close through the youngsters' years. But Lionel wasn't alone in the toy train market in the World War II period. Far from it. It had many competitors. Marx was one, but best known of all was A.C. Gilbert, which marketed a slightly smaller brand of train known as American Flyer S-Gauge. Let's take a look at this American Flyer caboose. We'll put it up against the Lionel car and you can see that it's smaller, but it has about the same amount of detail. American Flyer trains were slightly less expensive and were more popular in certain parts of the country where their advertising proved to be more effective. American Flyer made a number of freight cars, steam locomotives, and diesels and accessories. One of its finest steam locomotives was this model of a pre-Civil War train done in time for the centennial of the Civil War in 1960. And you can see again the amount of color, the detail. It is very much close to a scale model. Of all the trains that Lionel produced in the post-war era, none has been more popular and more beloved than the Santa Fe F3 diesel that it marketed between 1948 and well into the 1960s. You can see from looking at it, it's a beautiful locomotive of a popular and famous train that ran from Chicago to Los Angeles. Look at the detail, the colors on it. It had a horn, it whistled, it could do everything that a boy would like it to do. There are hundreds, if not thousands, that are still around. They're being run around Christmas trees every year, but you can find them in train stores and on internet websites for auction or for sale. You can find them every day. But it's definitely worth having and adding to your collection. More and more people are enjoying collecting toy trains and continuing to operate them even though they're 50 years old. What happened to the toy train hobby in the 1960s and 70s? It changed greatly. More and more youngsters were enjoying smaller scale HO and then N-scale trains. But they came back to the toy train hobby as they got older. When they reached their 30s and 40s, back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they wanted the trains that they'd had as youngsters, so they began pursuing them. New trains are still being made. Compare this one from the 1950s with this model from less than 10 years ago. You'll see it's a virtual scale model of a brand new locomotive that you'd find on the rails today. This is what's available now. It runs like a charm, just as the older one can still do. So in so many ways, the toy train hobby, whether you're collecting or whether you're operating, is better than ever. We've got great manufacturers, we've got terrific trains, and it all started really 100 years ago with this standard gauge locomotive. We've come a long way in 100 years, but what hasn't changed is the love that Americans have for their toy trains. It still is the world's greatest hobby.
You just heard Roger Karp talk a little bit about collecting toy trains. Well, I'm here to talk about operating toy trains. I've got a collection of locomotives here that represent modern productions. Lionel Trains actually has been the dominant name in toy train production for the last 100 years. Now, there are no fewer than 7 manufacturers producing great-looking modern toy trains. I've got before me a collection of items including MTH, Atlas O, Lionel, K-Line, Weaver, and Williams trains that have some of the finest detail you'd ever expect to see on a toy train. Some of the most notable features include crisp and accurate paint colors and decals, fine detail parts like see-through intake screens, opening cab doors, directional headlights, and other lighting effects from strobe, classification, and even ditch lights. Working exhaust or smoke units on both steam and diesel engines, and an amazing array of sounds. Let's take a closer look at some of these features. Today we have the advantage of using command control to control our toy trains. This is comparable to scale modelers using DCC to operate their layouts. There are two main systems, one from line L and one from MTH. Both have similar features. Let's see how some of these work. Here we have an engine from Atlas O. Using this controller, I can select any of the features this engine has on it, including sound, lights, the horn, a bell, and even the direction the train travels. There are even some special features that I can select using this remote. Now let's take a look at some of the features of a command-controlled steam engine. We've got the smoke, the whistle, the bells, and even the sound of steam. Toy trains have certainly gone high-tech, but they're still a great thrill to operate.
Meet the locomotives of the old Sierra Railway. They are the stars of the silver screen. No ego, just good looks. You'll find these beauties at Railtown 1897, a California State Historic Park in Jamestown. The old Jamestown train shops, part of the old Sierra Railway, were transformed into what is now called Railtown about 25 years ago. And when Hollywood found Railtown, it discovered gold. Known as the Movie Railroad, this 26-acre park is located along the main highway to Yosemite. It's been used by directors for more than 200 TV and movie projects, and old locomotive number 3 is the most photographed locomotive in Hollywood history. This beauty is more than 100 years old and has been seen with her co-stars in dozens of big-time pictures.
Hollywood discovered the Sierra Railway in early 1920. In the 1920s, and discovered that they could use the Sierra Railway to produce films, to give them the backdrop and the equipment they need to replicate any area of the country, including Kansas or Wyoming, the Great Plains, the foothills, and in some instances the Sierra mountain shots. The Sierra Railway could also provide the rolling stock, the engines, the passenger cars, the freight cars that could be used for any of the applications, of course, that we see in many of the great movies today. The name Railtown came into existence in the 1970s, around 1971, when the Sierra Railway recognized the ability to sell passenger tickets and conduct dinner trains. So in the great era of nostalgia, the 70s, the name Railtown came into existence to promote this place as a tourist destination. A lot of the buildings at Railtown date from 100 years ago, and of course, being an industrial facility, they built structures and buildings as they needed them. And pretty much all the buildings here survived fires and different changes in the industrial use of this place. And so the buildings here today are found pretty much as they were built over the past 60, 80, or 100 years. Our locomotive number 3 was brought here. It was built in 1891 and spent its first few years in Arizona. It is said to have brought the first passenger train, first revenue passenger train into Jamestown. It's been on the property ever since. It was built in a time when technology was changing in the railroad industry. So it's got the looks and the lines of the late 19th century equipment, but began performing like 20th century locomotives. So it can be used for any era in the 1800s and the 1900s. The Sierra Railroad had its first trains coming into Jamestown in November of 1897, and it was not too long before they realized that they needed to extend their line, and they extended it basically north into Calaveras County across the Stanislaus River Gorge, trying to tap into the lumber reserves that are on that side of the river. Our number 5 and 6 coaches, number 5 being a coach combine, able to carry baggage, were built in around 1903 to cross that Stanislaus River Canyon, and built short so they could make the switchbacks with a small engine. Hollywood particularly liked these cars because they were shorter, and when coupled into a train, it made a train look like it had more cars with a shorter picture. The number 28 has a good relationship between the speed and power, which was intended for this railroad, having tight turns and heavy grades. It's used today in our passenger operations because of its nice lines, and the movie industry in particular likes this locomotive because it can be made to look like a mainline locomotive in the films, or a nice short utility locomotive.
When you walk through Railtown, you'll be tracing the steps of some of the stars who have worked here, including W.C. Fields, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, John Wayne, and Ronald Reagan. You can look at the old roundhouse, the working turntable, and you'll step back in time when you see the belt-driven machine shops. Railtown is run by the California Parks and Recreation Department, the same folks who operate the prestigious State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. George Sapp is train engineer, tour guide, movie buff, and occasional resident of Hooterville.
When we leave the station here, the first thing we'll come across is our world-famous water tank, made famous by the Petticoat Junction TV series in the late 60s. People still want to know where the water tank is, and by golly, it's still here. Then we head out on the tracks through the rolling hills, the gold country. We actually passed right over the Mother Lode deposit, right out there by Rogers Cut, on our way down to Woods Creek. Woods Creek is where gold was first discovered in this county in 1849, caused a small gold strike here. A lot of settlements came out of that. Jamestown was settled by 1849.
When the Sierra Railway first started rolling back in 1897, the first train arrived carrying lumber. And, believe it or not, the Sierra Railroad itself is still very much alive. It's an active freight line with big plans for the future.
The Sierra Railroad was founded in 1897 by 3 men, Thomas Bullock, Prince Andre Poniatowski, and William H. Crocker. And their intent was to reach the mining interests that they controlled in the Sierra, in addition to supporting the growing lumber industry. The interesting thing is that in 1897, they began shipping lumber and mining products for $4 a ton. Today, 104 years later, we ship for $3.50 a ton. Sierra Railroad today has 3 principal elements. One is we're still a freight railroad, hauling thousands of cars a year of lumber and wood chips. We're also developing mining interests to haul limestone, sand, and gravel from the Sierra Railroad to the Bay Area. Second element is the passenger business, where we've started a gourmet dinner train called the Golden Sunset Dinner Train, operating out of a new train station we've built in Oakdale, California. So that is a growing element of the railroad. And the third is we're now going into the power industry, using locomotives to create electricity.
The excursion ride will give you a little history. You'll see that this historic railway has always been mining for precious natural resources and providing very rich natural memories.
We've reached the end of the line for this edition. We hope you've enjoyed the ride. We'll have more layouts, prototypes, and how-to tips next time, and more fun with the world's greatest hobby in the Dream, Plan, Build video series.
Welcome to the MR&T, Kalmbach Publishing Company's Employee Club layout. The original MR&T was built in our offices in downtown Milwaukee in the early 1970s. When the company moved to Waukesha, Wisconsin in the later 1980s, a new layout was built. Only a few pieces of the original layout remain, such as the town of Troy, which stands behind me. Model Railroader magazine uses the Milwaukee, Racine, and Troy as a test bed for new products, for scenery techniques, and we use it for a number of different cover shoots of the magazine. Let's take a trip around the MRT following an Amtrak train from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, all the way across the line to Rockford, Illinois. Since both staging yards are stub end, meaning that they stop and don't connect, we have an incline track that's on a 3% grade that connects the upper and the lower level. We use this track when we open the layout for public display so trains can run around the loop unimpeded. The MRT, or the Milwaukee, Racine, and Troy, starts in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As you can see, our Amtrak train is passing through the Milwaukee Union Station, heading on its way west to Rockford, Illinois, the line's terminus. Here you can see our Amtrak train is passing through the station on its way to the yards at Port Marquette. As our train enters Port Marquette Yard, we pass the engine servicing facility on the MRT. Here we can see the large sand tower used to add sand to the locomotives for traction. Port Marquette Yard is the classification yard on the MRT. Here, all trains that travel the line stop or start their trips, and their cars are sorted for other destinations. As the train leaves the yard, it heads over Oklahoma Avenue. This bridge scene was a construction project in the magazine in 2005. From here, the train heads towards Hales Corners and a series of industries to be switched. Between Hales Corners and Big Bend is this bridge scene. The MRT is used to represent not only southern Wisconsin, but a variety of different regions in the United States because it's used so much in the magazine. Keeping with that theme of geological locations, this stone viaduct is a common feature in many eastern settings. Part of the idea behind the MRT is a recycle-reuse policy. This town, shown as Big Bend, Wisconsin, was actually part of a project railroad that ran in the magazine about 10 years ago. The MRT is actually a work in progress and may never be finished. This town of Mugwanago is a current project that will probably be featured in the magazine in the coming year. After our train left Big Bend and Mugwanago, we started a 1.5% grade. The MRT is actually built as a spiraling upward main line so that the staging yard that is used to represent Rockford can sit on top of the staging yard used for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Our train continues to climb the main line as we pass Lake Beulah. As a crew pulls their train out of the town of Winter Hill, a branch line on the MR&T, in the distance we can see our Amtrak train approaching the summit of the line at Sky Ridge. The curved steel trestle at Sky Ridge is the highest elevation on the MR&T and stands a full 68 inches above the floor. Once the train passes the summit at Sky Ridge, it enters a 3% grade all the way down to Williams Bay. The rock crusher at Winter Hill is based on a real prototype found on the Santa Fe Railway. Our Amtrak train crosses the Fox River on this high bridge. The bridge also crosses the branch line to Winter Hill. During the course of the year, the MR&T gets visitors from a number of different places. Anyone can stop by our corporate offices between 9 and 4 o'clock during the day and get a tour of the Milwaukee, Racine, and Troy. Around the layout are a number of signs and placards to help visitors understand how the railroad works and the towns that they are passing. As the train rounds the corner on its way to its final destination in Rockford, a local tips his hat and we say goodbye.
We've reached the end of the line for this edition. We hope you've enjoyed the ride. We'll have more layouts, prototypes, and how-to tips next time, and more fun with the world's greatest hobby in the Dream, Plan, Build video series. Welcome to the Dream, Plan, Build video series. In this collection, you'll see amazing layouts of fellow modelers, some of the most interesting trains and railroads around, and plenty of tips and techniques to make your time at the workbench and at the throttle more productive and a lot more fun. We'll travel across America in search of layouts we all dream of operating and get inside the heads of their builders as they describe how they designed and built their prized railroads. Plus, whether you're running a 4x8 or a 40x80 operation, you'll discover tips and techniques to make your rolling stock run smoother and look more realistic.